I'm so pleased today to talk to my guest, music theorist, historian, pianist, and singer, Dr. Marco Pollaci. Following his studies as a pianist and singer, he graduated in a liberal arts music and performing arts degree from the University of Tor Vergata in Rome with Dr. Giorgio Sanguinetti, and he went on to receive his PhD in music from the University of Nottingham in 2018. Dr. Pollaci's research focuses on the 18th and 19th century opera and music history. He's interested in sketch studies, music theory, music analysis. Further research interests include Partimento studies and Italian compositional practice in the 18th and 19th century. So he's currently working as an assistant researcher for a Partimento project for the Department of Musicology of Pavia. Dr. Pollaci, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks a lot. First of all, I'm very happy to discuss this music field in your show. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about 19th century Partimento tradition. Thank you very much.
Before we start, could you give me a quick introduction to yourself and your musical training prior to your Partimento research?
Absolutely. First of all, if I may, I'd like to recall again this great interest that involves also my research, but with other great scholars that you have the opportunity to interview in this art of Partimento, which is growing up significantly. For example, I'm so delighted to realize that the group that I created on Facebook, the Art of Partimento, is going on very, very well, and lots of other 18th and also sometimes 19th century Partimento events that are going on in very important way. For example, I should recall the interest of the Smarano International Academy event this summer with the great musicians and scholars such as Giorgio Sanguinetti, who and Edoardo Bellotti and Enrico, amongst the others, under the artistic direction of Massimiliano Guido. So basically, what I mean is this interest in this field is really, really going on. And basically, this is just to sum up the main interest of this summer and these interviews and so on. Today, I would like to talk about the Partimento tradition in 19th century, as we mentioned. Basically, what happened in following the golden age, shall we say, in the 18th century regarding the Partimento, the Neapolitan methods in Italy, but also in Europe, shall we say, and what changed, what remains, what was the legacy until at least the turn of the century and so on. So my research is an interest to find out more, to discover the sources, to consider, first of all, the recent studies. I should mention, for example, an important paper by Robert Verdi again, which introduced the teaching on Partimento realization in 19th century Paris, for example, or the Nicholas Balvanov book, which is a great work regarding the 19th century Partimento sources in Italy, and the focus on Puccini, but also on other musicians, and also amongst the others, the Giorgio Sanguinetti study on Beethoven and the Partimento pattern, which is another great work, is coming out soon.
Are these new books and new articles that have been written recently?
Yeah, basically some papers and the works that I just mentioned that are in the last couple of years, if I'm not wrong, and the Giorgio Sanguinetti article is coming out very soon. And Professor Balvanov also book is, if I'm not wrong, in 2012, so quite recent, not in the very recent, but in the last years, of course, shall we say, as well as the interest that will be involved in another subject, which is the solfeggio tradition, 18th, 19th century by Nicholas Balvanov. But this is another field. But amongst these studies, and surely other important studies that I just mentioned, what I would like to recall is the importance and interest that has still a lot of gaps regarding the 19th century Partimento traditions.
Can you give us an idea, what were the gaps that people had at the time that were kind of a confusion for people? So what were the things that now have been understood but we didn't know a few years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. During the 19th century, in Italy, of course, but as well as Europe, the Partimento tradition surely was still alive and not completely forgotten, especially in the first part of the 19th century, but I must say also in the in the later 19th century. Of course, theoretical and compositional practice influences from, for example, the French and the German traditions made significant change. So the Partimento tradition, of course, started to be considered, it was a really great will to transmit and preserve this tradition in written way. So the perfect communion between theory and practice in the golden age, shall we say, in the 18th century, of course, it started to decline. And the influence of the Ramonian theories on the German, of course, theoretical works influenced quite a lot.
That's really interesting. So you just said that because the German influence started to seep in to even Italy, so we were starting to see, like, in Italy, people were interested in German music theory?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Rameau is French, and would you say Riemann, is that right, functional theory?
Amongst the others. That's an analytical approach, but especially Ramonian theory, from France and the German theories as well. But what I want to highlight and observe with my research and today is that, however, all these influence didn't stop the importance of Partimento tradition. The interest, if I may recall, an entertaining episode that it's included in the outstanding book by Giorgio Sanguinetti, who is entirely dedicated to the art of Partimento. It might explain this interest still at the end of the 19th century. For example, in the 1901, having won the prestigious Prix de Rome, a younger composer, Andrea Capelletto, was in Rome after being commissioned by the director of the Conservatoire de Paris, Edouard Dubois, to locate some important musical manuscripts called partimenti, exactly what partimenti manuscripts, and bring copies of them back to Paris. After finding the desired documents, Capelletto was, however, unable to obtain them because the director of the library, always politely evasive, never gave permission for the copies to be made.
So I've heard about this, that they are very, very secretive, right, about their tradition, and they did not want people to know the secret of how they composed and improvised so quickly.
Exactly. So this episode that I wanted to recall is a particular significant because actually is emblematic of a lively interest, even outside of Italy at the turn of the century, in the pedagogic method of the Neapolitan school, this most important pedagogic tradition, and that had dominated the European musical scene for, shall we say, over 2 centuries at least. So, as you mentioned, much has been written about this composition originally in the 18th century, but the importance of its tradition, never forgotten, is still alive in the following centuries for instrumental music, for theoretical works, and for opera, Italian, but also French opera traditions, is something that still needs, I started this research that is going on, but actually still has some gaps to consider. Although there's a foreign influence, there's a need to modernize the theoretical and the compositional practice in the 19th century, but what remains?
There's a very strong tradition of counterpoint, right, in Partimento and Italian Neapolitan, and fugue writing is something very difficult, and that's left to very advanced students. Do we see less fugues in music of the 19th century as people go into more romantic music? There's not much fugal writing, and people are trying to change the curriculum to more of a romantic kind of sound?
Yeah, that's right. They tried to change it. Actually, especially in the second half of the 19th century, the fugues started to become, shall we say, an academic exercises, a bit far from the practice that you used to have in the 18th century, when the art of improvisation, the counterpoint, the art of the fugues, of course, the Partimento methods, were all united following the music, the music itself. But the question is very interesting because during my research, for example, I had a chance to discover some rare manuscripts still preserved in Naples regarding some late 19th century operatic composers. I should mention, for example, Francesco Cilea, Umberto Giordano, Puccini's generation, shall we say. And however, these kind of fugues that they used to practice and to write, they still were heavily influenced by the Partimento tradition and by the Neapolitan methods. So basically, depends which part of Italy and Europe we are talking about. But however, in France, for example, the other method of the fugues became very close to what nowadays we study with academic École Française, for example. Although in Naples, this desire to preserve the Partimento tradition, or in other parts of Italy, as this evidence of these autographs, we can still see that the fugues didn't follow actually the other, shall we say, modern models or the actual academic form that we might think today. So that's actually, it was a really interesting question to see the difference, but the tradition was still not forgotten.
Now, you mentioned some Italian opera composers. Was Italian opera in the 19th century pretty much the dominant, was that what Italian musicians were going for, to be opera composers? Was that not so much church musicians anymore, or more for secular operatic performance?
Yeah, well, it might surprise to consider probably that actually still at the end of the 19th century in Italy, for example, operatic composers such as Giacomo Puccini or Francesco Cilea or Alfredo Catalani or still needed to produce or to work as students, but also as professional composers in the first years of their career. Church music, sacred works, because it was still considered actually passport to find a job in the case of an operatic career. So we have studies, works regarding the church music, but this is interesting because we can still observe a link with the past, with the 18th century music. For example, Francesco Cilea, these operatic composers belonging to the Giovane Scuola generation, always considered the importance to study the great master of the 18th century Partimento tradition, or even before. I shall mention, for example, Alessandro Scarlatti, but other Francesco Durante, or the Neapolitan master. They actually mention all time, even in their career, in their letters, in the importance to keep alive this tradition for young composers, for people or for students that still in the first years of the 20th century, students actually wanted to study to become great composers. Of course, we have a sort of change and the school started to decline. But what I mean is that the Partimento tradition was still alive and started to decline exactly with the last echoes of the great Italian opera seasons. And once the great Italian opera season started to decline with the Puccini, for example, a generation, the Partimento had the same destiny.
You mentioned Giovane Scuola. Is that means the young school, right? And is that the golden age of the final golden age of Italian opera?
Absolutely. These composers represent the last great Italian composers, operatic composers, which, of course, Puccini is one of them, well known, probably the most famous. But of course, I should mention Alfredo Catalani, Mascagni, and Umberto Giordano, amongst the others, and Ruggero Leoncavallo. But what was interesting for me during my research, for example, my PhD work, was to discover evidences, so autographs regarding the Partimento tradition still alive. For example, I could find Umberto Giordano's sketch with his own Partimento elaboration, a realization, shall we say, in the late Neapolitan conservatory, San Pietro Maiella, in the late 19th century. So, of course, written That's what is the main, one of the main changes at the end of the century. If we compare with the great golden season in the previous century. So these exercises, they are preserved, they are very rare, but because they were written, or I had occasion to study a very rare other sources with the Alfredo Catalani counterpoint chords, which represent a strong influence with the Partimento tradition itself. Mattei or Zingarelli, I'm mentioning other great Partimento masters of the past.
So you said the young school, and they were this golden age. Now, weren't they associated with the Milan school, not so much the Neapolitan school? And is that a difference in Partimento tradition, or by that point, is it very similar?
Well, that's interesting. I could just do a general review. Basically, in Naples, the tradition, of course, from this city where actually the Partimento tradition was essential, the desire to keep it alive was a very, very, very important. In Milan, I concentrated mainly in the Neapolitan or in some Tuscan institution, but in my research, I started to have a look also in the Milan conservatory. Of course, everything, shall we say, depends if we are talking in the first part of the century and in the last part in the late 19th century, because we are talking about a great period with a different change, different flux of theories, musicians, teaching. So actually, Milan or Naples, there were two centers with a lot of musical and theoretical change. But in Milan, of course, I think had, shall we say, great lots of influences from Germany, from France, the same influence that we mentioned before were very relevant, significant in the music education of younger composers, more than probably in Milan. I would like to mention some other examples that might help to sum up the situation. In Milan, the pressure mounted on music school to modernize themselves, of course, was really strong. But I would like to mention some sources that in all Italian peninsula, also outside of Italy, were still considered to preserve this tradition. For example, Emanuele Imbimbo, Vincenzo Fiocchi, Gaspare Selvaggi, they represented Neapolitan theories in Paris in the 19th century. In Italy, Fenaroli's annotated editions, the great Fenaroli legacy, represented the will to transmit the pedagogic methods. And another volume that I would like to mention, Emanuele Guarnaccia, in the 1830 was printed, and other editions were printed in, for example, 1846, Placido Mandanici's Regole, and another annotated edition of Fenaroli's Partimenti, edited by Luigi Felici Rossi. What I mean is basically, although the different theories and influence that you mentioned before, these sources and this will in Milan, in Naples, in Lucca, or in the general Italy, as well as in France, for example, to preserve, to transmit this tradition was very, very, very strong. This is the observation that I would like to recall. We all think about other theories, other instrumental operatic composers, and the musicology literature always stress the accent on for example, other modern theories. But with all this change that I mentioned before, the tradition actually never died, or at least started to decline, but was essential for Beethoven, for Chopin, for Schumann, because we can find the Partimento patterns in all their music. And of course, we are talking now about opera. All the opera composers, since the Bellini, Verdi, or until Puccini generation, had this common legacy in their training, different ways sometimes, and the legacy in their operatic works actually was a common heritage that was very, very important for all of them as a sort of a common tonal language for all the 19th century operatic composer for sure, but not only for the operatic composer, if I may. So I hope that I tried to do in a short time a general overview of the links between opera and the Partimento tradition, because basically what is important is all of them in different way that a training was heavily influenced.
You know, when people think of the 19th century, they think of romantic music, and they have a romantic ideal of the 19th century, and they believe that people like Chopin and Schumann and Liszt and Verdi and Brahms, they fell out of the sky, geniuses, and they did no training, they just were geniuses from the beginning. But what you're saying is they had a lineage of training. Let's take Bellini, for instance, a very famous operatic composer. So Vincenzo Bellini, can you talk about him? Was he a Neapolitan trained musician?
Yeah, I would talk about Bellini with great pleasure. Actually, is one of my favorite composers, operatic composers. It's something very, very important and very right. The German theory, and we still have this legacy in the musicological literature sometimes of this romantic idea of spontaneous genius and about regarding the music production in the 19th century. So is still strong with a general overlook regarding the importance of the training and the study, the sketch, the autograph manuscripts, the sources, the studies that these composers actually they had, the essential importance of their training.
Can you tell the audience what kind of training did Bellini have in these Neapolitan conservatories?
So Bellini was born in Sicily, but following the great, of course, influence or the importance of the Neapolitan school that was famous in all peninsula, he was sent to study in Naples, and he could study with the great masters at the beginning of the 19th century, such as Giacomo Tritto and Zingarelli. He could study Partimento, counterpoint, following the Neapolitan methods and the art of solfeggio, of course.
Those names you just mentioned, they're very, very important names, right? Those teachers.
Absolutely. They were among the great Neapolitan masters of the time. And Bellini could study a lot and had very great training for years with the Partimento, with this great art of composition and pedagogic method, who formed the base of the work of his work and, of course, of his composition activity that today is well known. Sure, recall just the production operas such as Norma, I Puritani, and so on. So, of course, he was a genius, as well as other operatic composers such as Donizetti or Rossini. But the importance of the training that they had that allowed them to compose sometimes in few weeks great masterpieces that we know today. Is something that it must be considered. Bellini, for example, is one of these composers of the golden age, of course, of the Italian opera season, but I mentioned also Donizetti, Rossini, and of course Verdi, and so on. In my research, I recently published an article and had occasion to spoke about the importance of Partimento composition and practice Bellini's operas, to underline actually the link and the use of the Partimento pattern in some of Bellini works, for example, Norma or I Puritani, some musical passages, because my idea was also to consider the training, consider the sources and this legacy, but also to consider why and how an operatic composer, for example, might have chosen this pattern in his musical creations. So the what I mean is the Partimento tradition could also be a very interesting instrument for the 19th century music analysis.
So what you're saying, Dr. Pollaci, is you could actually look at a Bellini opera and you can see patterns that are found in Partimento exercises?
Correct, absolutely. My interest was to study these Partimento patterns, recalling also the well-known schemata theory called by Robert Gerdigan in his book Music in the Galant Style. These patterns, these formulas used in the 19th century as a topoi to recall a particular atmosphere as a musical cliché. Of course, in a different way from an 18th century composer, but still present in their musical language, in their musical dictionary, shall we say, and how Bellini could choose one or another pattern within his a musical passage, an aria or a duet. So the link between his training and this legacy and the music creations by Bellini. So not just the scheme itself, but also the way to use and consider also that Bellini was a genius, but also why and how this legacy was so important in Il Pirata, in Norma, or I Puritani, as well as other operatic works.
It's a good choice to choose Bellini because I think he was born, 1801, right in the beginning of the 19th century. And he was well admired by people like Chopin, Liszt, and even Richard Wagner himself, Mr. Germany. He actually wrote a very complimentary article or something about Bellini, and he was complimenting his abilities.
That's right. I would recall that actually a lot of other foreign composers, French, or even Wagner himself, they ignored the Italian tradition at all, and the influence of the Italian opera. And that's right, Wagner really had a great esteem of Bellini's work as well as Chopin. And Bellini is one of the Italian composers sometimes is still overlooked for the easy, long melodies, as Verdi used to call Bellini's melody.
It's quite shocking. I read your article, and the only reason we're listening to Bellini now is because there was a revival, I think, in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, correct. Bellini, of course, Maria Calla was one of the most important figure to do this revival, Bellini in the 1950s, and of course other sopranos followed her steps until nowadays to this Bellini Renaissance and so on. Also, of course, other musicological studies and critical editions, they helped a lot to rediscover the study and the importance of the Bellini. I should mention other scholars, among them, for example, Fabrizio della Seta, but one of the Greek scholars that actually work a lot on Bellini, and but among the others. But my interest specifically on Bellini and his work was exactly, I think, it's something quite new to connect this music field, is the Partimento tradition, and as an analytical approach instrument for his works. And that is something that I think it might interest also Rossini, Donizetti, and of course I think that we will have further studies also regarding Giuseppe Verdi and the other Partimento tradition, for example, who studied with another very important teacher, was Vincenzo Lavigna, another master heavily influenced by the Neapolitan tradition. So this common language in the 19th century show us that with the focus of our talk, that the Neapolitan method even changed, even with the other influences sometimes within his theoretical approach, was still alive and not forgotten.
One more question about Bellini. Now, he's known for long flowing melodic lines, long melodies. Is that something that can be connected with the Partimento tradition, long melodies?
Yeah, I believe so. There are there are studying going on regarding, for example, the importance of the melody, and another pillar of the Neapolitan tradition, which are the solfeggi. And Nicolas Balavanat is going to publish the next year a book, a great work regarding this tradition. But this is regarded another pillar of the Neapolitan method. What I would like to focus exactly is the Partimento, as you mentioned very right. And basically, you said the link between opera and the Partimento, right? Regarding the Partimento itself, the importance to improvise melodies and was, of course, essential. And the harder training that they had for example, Bellini had in the Neapolitan Conservatory, of course, was essential to create these long melodies, following the famous recall by Verdi about Bellini's melodies. So, of course, you're right. There is a strictly connection between the Partimento, all the Neapolitan rules, the bass motions, the use of the rule of the octave, but also the art of counterpoint, following the Neapolitan approach, which allowed to compose sometimes quickly, to improvise, to sing melodies. And of course, Bellini had something more, because he had the great art to compose these great melodies, which apparently they could seem simple if we compare to other, for example, to other traditions like Wagner, but actually they were really, shall we say, importance inside the general composition art of these composers. So in other words, they look similar, but they are the result of a great art to compose in the 19th century. Bellini was, in my opinion, was one of the greatest operatic composers of all time, and other analytical studies they are put in evidence this. And in my opinion, the art of Partimento was essential also for this purpose, to allow this composer to become what they actually were. Bellini, but could be also other Italian or French. I studied, for example, I could mention another French operatic composer in the 19th century was Massenet. I published an article regarding his training, and we can, of course, see the importance of the Partimento tradition even for a French composer like Jules Massenet, who produced great operatic works.
How do you determine that the French, have that tradition as well? Is it because the Paris Conservatory, they have that kind of similar, founded upon Italian methods?
That's right. Basically, they were masters, and that they, if I'm wrong, at the beginning of the 19th century, they went to Paris for job opportunities, and they start also to transmit this legacy, even with the printed edition that I mentioned before. So the Partimento edition could be alive in the 19th century Paris, for example, conservatory. And in my research, I realized that, and I studied at Massenet. I mentioned this composer because that's why my investigation was about, but I assume also other of the Massenet generation who studied actually in Paris. We can see the methods, and actually the Savard, another master of professor in Paris who taught to Massenet, still used in written way the Partimenti, for example. So Massenet could study the art of Partimento thanks to these manuals and to this tradition, and to this master like Savard, who still taught in the 19th century the Partimento tradition, who actually came from Italy, but which I should recall that Italian masters that went they traveled in all Europe, and they spread this method and these theories in all Europe. Recently, I talked in a conference in September about, for example, the Partimento tradition still alive in Russia, in Tchaikovsky, because we should recall that. I should mention that the Italian master Paisiello in the 18th century, they immigrated to the Russia. So it's not something located just in Italy, but of course in all Europe and outside of Europe, countries like Russia, this tradition, still had important echoes.
Very widespread. Okay, now let me ask you this. This is going to be an important question that I'm curious about: is how did German harmony affect Partimento?
That's a good question. So I think that the German theories and influences, and also what we mentioned before, the Rameau theory as well, so also the French, they had a strong influence in the, shall we say, in the approach. For example, the perfect union of improvisation practice and theoretical studies that we could have in the 18th century, what started to be broken, started to decline for these modern harmony theories that they started to influence even in Italy.
That's right, because harmony was integrated, right, into counterpoint and Partimento, and it became a separate subject.
Absolutely. As the studies regarding the 18th century tradition, they showed very, very clearly, basically all composers, Mozart, or for example, and all the great 18th century composers, they didn't study the harmony in the way that we think and we teach today. They didn't know the modern concept, of course, of the harmony based on the exercises in written, in the bass, harmonic bass, in chords, etc., following also the Romanian theories. It was a very fascinating link and shall we say link, yeah, exactly, among the art of improvising, was essential for all the 18th century, but still further in the 19th century, and the practice and the theory. They didn't have this division which contributed to, I would say, unfortunately, decline the golden area and the method of the Partimento tradition in the 19th century. We can study these treatises, these sources that I mentioned before, because actually they were written. In the 18th century, we have a sort of Zibaldoni and rules, but not a lot of prescription and exercising following the modern German or French.
So what if somebody said, Dr. Pollaci, let's say I'm learning this German harmony, these rules that you're teaching me in Partimento, they sound old-fashioned. Maybe we should look at these new ways of approaching it, because there are rules, right, to Partimento. There are rules that you have to follow, and then there's the rule of the octave. There's how you figure each bass note. How did that change when you started to have more chromatic things going on?
Yeah, well, I would like to say, first of all, that consider this rediscovery of Partimento tradition nowadays, even comparing to the modern theories and the general music education approach, would be something that it would be really, really interesting, and lots of work is going on about this. So basically, like the event that I mentioned before is Milano, etc. Giuseppe Verdi said in a famous sentence, "Let's go back to the past and it will be a progress." I think that in the modern education, the Partimento method would be something that would help not just to study the past, but also to produce, of course, we can't write music like probably an 18th century composer, but the importance, for example, of the art of improvising and singing the melodies and the counterpoint, the fugues, and so on, is something that it's as a great has a great importance even for young students today. And I would say that can teach us a lot. And the colleagues and the scholars that you recently interviewed, there are also the great worker, I mentioned Verdi and Giorgio Sanguinetti, for example, and so on. They work regarding this legacy nowadays about the schematic theory and so on. Is something that is really, really important because we could actually learn not only the past, but also for a modern approach, rather than, write a lot of written exercises, but sometimes we can say Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, they did something different and they studied in different ways.
Okay, so this is my next question, is a lot of people have taken Roman numerals and tried to analyze 18th century music, and it doesn't quite seem to work as well as approaching 18th century music with Partimento. My question is, can you take 19th century romantic music and try to look at it with a Partimento lens, and would that be much easier to analyze?
In my opinion, of course, you can, and it's something that's really, really fascinating. Easy or not, well, depends on the approach and, of course, of the interest on your research, on the musicians or musicologists research. Of course, the Partimento is a field that could highlight a lot the romantic music, the 19th century music in terms of music analysis, but also could help us to better understand even the actual perform of these operatic work as well as instrumental music. And I think there are also lots of interconnection with, for example, with other general or specific analytical approach, something like the, shall we say, Schenkerian analysis or other analytic point of view, that actually there are not, but this is a very big topic that we can't talk about, but in other words, to answer to your question, the important, even for the performing and the analytical approach and the study of romantic or the general 19th century music, surely for the first part of the century, but even further, is something that can help us a lot to better understand the music itself, as you mentioned. I do agree with you.
That's interesting. So, if you go onto YouTube, you can type in, for instance, Richard Wagner, you can type in Tristan, and I'm sure there's a person there who's analyzed it with Roman numerals. The whole page looks pretty crazy. I'm wondering if we can take all this music and look at it more in a Partimento way, and it's a lot easier to analyze these works without complicated Roman numerals and all sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. But what it's I would like to mention, of course, especially in the late 19th century composers, we can't expect, this is something that I should mention, the same way to compose or only or just Partimento edition. So we had a different language, a lot of influences, etc. But what is interesting sometimes is to see this legacy still alive and how is integrated in an interesting dialogue between the past and the way these composers might have integrated within their music creations with the modern language or with the tonal language of their period.
Oh, good example. Okay, let's jump to Verdi then, because Verdi is an example of someone who has different eras, and he's I guess a Neapolitan trained musician, is he not?
Correct. Yeah, I mentioned before the importance of this training from Vincenzo Lavigna for the young Verdi, and this tradition that Verdi considered in great esteem all his life in his letter, and he did never forget this tradition because it was something important. Of course, the production of Verdi changed a lot, and Verdi was so great in his music that he considered all these possibilities and of the musical language of his time. But surely he did use patterns, and he did use the Partimento method integrated in his operatic works. And I am sure that further studies might highlight this interesting aspect that is something that is really, in my opinion, is really fascinating, is really interesting, how Verdi could use the Partimento legacy consciously, probably, for in his work, and how something that's important for the great difference for me between an 18th century composer and a 19th century is that these schemes for a 19th century composer, they were still part of of their language, but they could pick up one or another and integrate in their works. For an 18th century composer, it was something automatically. So as we heard in the previous interview from the other scholars that talked about this tradition. In the 19th century, something, of course, it changed. So it's not in automatically way they could choose rule of the octave, a Meyer scheme, for example, or a Romanesca pattern, just to mention something, but they are still present in their works, and it's interesting to study, as I started, and to do why and how these schemes were used by Bellini, Rossini, Verdi, or Chopin, Schumann, Brahms, of course, and all these great composers that they had this common, also this mutual legacy, I think.
I mean, we have such a German view of history, especially with classical music, but I mean, Italian music really, if you think about it, might have been probably just as, if not more, in terms of popularity, bigger in Europe.
Absolutely, that's right. And this is a general view that we still have today in the music, in the historiography and the music book sometimes, although it didn't stop this interesting field that it keeps going on much another relevant number of studies and events and so on. So the interest in the Partimento tradition, thanks to all these events, and to program like yours, for example, that is interested in this field, is something that is really interesting in the music studies in the recent years, because I'm sure that in terms of analytical work, study of the sources, musicological studies, opera studies, and so on, the Partimento tradition will have a lot to say.
What has surprised you about your research?
Well, for example, in the sources, the late 19th century sources that I studied, these rare autographs that sometimes I discovered or I found in the musical institutions in Italy, I didn't expect to find still, even in written way, so good for us because it's being preserved, this heavy link with the past and the will to transmit through these masters like Pietro Platania, for example, other Italian masters in the turn of the century, these traditions, or, for example, in a modern language, musical language like Tchaikovsky or Massenet or Umberto Giordano, for example, among the other music techniques, still these Partimento patterns, and quite often, and used sometimes probably as a normal part of the musical language, but sometimes you use it in specific ways. And that's something that did interest me a lot.
So are you saying that these patterns that you see are composers who are not Italian? Did they study it, or are they just using the patterns because they're very popular at that time?
Well, sometimes we have evidence of the training, like I mentioned, for example, in the case of Massenet. Sometimes we, for example, couldn't find at the moment, as far as I know, specific exercises or sources regarding Tchaikovsky, the case of this great Russian composer, regarding his training. But Neapolitan method, they were still alive in Tchaikovsky's time. There are recent studies by Gedinger, for example, or modern or printed books that they put in evidence this legacy. And in Tchaikovsky's language, we still have this legacy. And I started to do this investigation, but it's quite interesting to see actually that even if you don't know a lot about their training, why and how, in other words, in direct way or not, probably, it's interesting to see that even at the turn of the century, for other composers, in the first part of the 20th century, we still have this the legacy of this tradition. It didn't die at all, in different way, of course, but I am sure there is still a lot to discover and to fill this gap regarding this. And I want to discover more in my research, in my study in the archives and my future work. But I am more than sure that this gap will have a lot of surprises, and it will still going on, the rediscovery of this tradition.
When you looked at the Naples Conservatory archives and the Conservatory of Lucca archives, now, historically, I mean, you're Italian. That's something that foreigners really couldn't do right up until recently, to look at these amazing archives and to really look at that. Like you said, was there a secretive stance, a position that we shouldn't share this amazing material?
Yeah, that's a good point. Basically, me as a researcher, sometimes I did find it difficult. It's not always to do a deep research in the archives in Italy or in Europe, because sometimes it's not so easy to find what actually you are looking for. But another interesting point is, even when this institution, these libraries, etc., possess this material, preserves this material, in the last years, for example, before this rediscovery, the Partimento tradition, lots of people didn't give the right attention to this sketch, these notebooks. What is actually a Partimento? Is it like a baseline, that's it, or something else? Why do we need to study an exercise or just a mere sketch, or regarding the training? I'm talking not the sketch for a critical edition, for example, but the actual training of this composer. Why the student years materials, autographs are so important? We always have an overlooked point of view of these sources, these autographs, because we thought, well, they don't tell us a lot. And now, with this rediscovery, the importance to study these sources, these guidelines, these autographs that were ignored until a few decades ago. Now there is another point of view. So we started to realize why is it so important. I'm doing in the 19th century, but the works of the other great scholars, they of course focus on the 18th century sources, and we can appreciate why these manuscripts about Partimento, for example, they are so important. What they can tell us, they are not just old-fashioned exercises.
Give us a sense of scale. How much material is in these conservatories, and how much have researchers dug through? Is there like a lot more left, or have we had a good survey?
A lot indeed. There are so much.
Give an idea. How much are we talking about here?
Well, I can't give a specific number, because every time musicologists tried to do research, we sometimes we discover a lot. I didn't discover a lot about the 19th century opera composers, but in the European, just to focus on in Europe specifically, but not just in Europe for sure, libraries, archives, churches sometimes, so ecclesiastic institutions, they preserve a huge amount of sources regarding Neapolitan tradition, solfeggi, partimenti, counterpoint exercises, fugues, materials. I mean, there are lots. If you think just how many musical archives or churches we have in Italy, and every time you go there, you never know. Sometimes you can find a lot, because this tradition actually for at least 2 centuries was so important that the Neapolitan or the Italian master, they traveled a lot.
I actually just want to end off with some kind of fun questions, if you don't mind. Do you have favorite partimenti? Like, could you have any exercises that you think are really fun, that you think people should check out?
Well, I have some, shall we say, I really have a great interest to study and great esteem and to study sources and partimenti, but particularly Neapolitan master. My interest, for example, I really like the Francesco Durante's material sources, and his approach for me is really appealing.
What's appealing about Durante?
Well, for example, for me it's interesting to see the long tradition from Durante to Zingarelli, because, for example, in this case, involves specifically the teachings of composers such as Vincenzo Bellini. So for me, it's interesting to see the legacy of these masters and the teaching that were passed through these masters, their methods to Bellini. That's, for example, what interests me a lot. And I must say that my research focuses on mainly of these composers and their sources. Mattei is another composer. Shall we say Zingarelli, Fenaroli, and for example Mattei. So I say they are interesting to me because their legacy, specifically in the late 19th century, is very strong, comparing to Leonardo Leo or other composers or masters that their tradition started to decline. So Fenaroli, for example, is a really interesting for me because his legacy was essential for all 19th century.
Could you talk about how widespread Fenaroli's partimenti exercises were in Europe?
Yeah, of course. At the beginning of our talk, I didn't mention briefly some annotated and printed editions, which actually, what I wanted to say is the Fenaroli's partimenti rules, these regole, they were printed, annotated, sometimes changed in written way, but they were transmitted in Italy and then in also, for example, in Paris, as I mentioned before, through these editions. So this knowledge, this music knowledge, and Fenaroli's method were pretty much alive because while other master sources started to decline on the shall we say they started to be considered old-fashioned, Fenaroli's legacy was very alive, and so the Zingarelli's one, and Mattei, for example, I could find their rules, their partimento sources in the exercises and in the teaching, in the student years sources materials about operatic composer from Fenaroli's rules, from
you can see them. You can see them in the operas.
Absolutely.
He gets really difficult, right? I mean, if you get to book 5 and book 6, I mean, it starts to get kind of crazy.
Yeah. Of course, you need to start since the beginning, and these fascinating tools, of course, require the training, require the practice, and a keyboard. And of course, for a modern music theory teachers, they could look different. They are different and they could look, how can we say, more complicated because we are more familiar with another approach. So, but in the 18th, 19th century, these kind of teachings, of course, they were the base of the training. So they knew what to do, how to do, and etc. And with this training, this training was considered a perfect passport, regardless your specialization, if you were an instrumentalist or for instrument music, for an opera composer, for a singer, etc. This training was considered a perfect passport to become a professional musician in Italy as well as in Europe itself. So it's something quite globalized, actually.
Dr. Pollaci, final question, and the question is, let's talk about the 19th century. A lot of people love the 19th century, the romantic music and all of that. How can Partimento assist in understanding the music of the 19th century, and how can we use it to improve our education and our music education?
In the 19th century, yeah. Well, my opinion, as I mentioned before, the Partimento is a very important and good, fascinating, I would say, instrument for music analysis, which intends to study the 19th century repertoire for all the reasons that we just talked about. So for analytical studies, I would consider the Partimento tools and the schemata theory and the Neapolitan school itself a very wonderful point of view to study the music of both operatic composer or instrument music, such as Beethoven or, as I said, Schubert, Brahms, Chopin, and many others. So to study this repertoire and to consider, I think, to better understand their repertoire with a different, without prejudice, or consider a Wagnerian approach and a modern theoretical approach with a modern German or point of views or Romanian approach. For music education and the study of this repertoire, Partimento is surely something that can tell us a lot.
Should we still keep with the Roman numerals, and should we still keep with the traditional tonal harmonic analysis?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, if you mean that we still needed to, I mean, I'm not saying that we needed to analyze everything with the Partimento edition, but surely it can be a perfect integration with all the modern analytical instruments that we have. Of course, if probably Riemann theories or the other approach probably they don't match a lot with this approach, but just for practical reasons, of course. So it depends on what you intend to study and what's your interest and of course. But I definitely would rediscover and would insert the Partimento teaching as an instrument for music education, for analytical study, and to study the actual music repertoire in the university conservatoires and the music school. Why not? Absolutely.
Dr. Pollaci, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this very important topic and sharing your expertise on Partimento in the 19th century. This is very cutting edge as far as I'm concerned, and I really want this more people to learn about this. I think it's very fascinating. I think it's very effective. It makes music so fun to compose and improvise, and I think you guys and the Art of Partimento Facebook group and all the research and everybody, all the musicologists and historians and performers, keep doing what you're doing. I'm really excited to see what great things you guys will come in the next couple of years. Dr. Pollaci, would you like to promote any project or events that are coming up?
Well, there is an event that I mentioned before that is still going on, if I'm wrong, that I would recall an important and wonderful event at the end of that is started at the end of July, which is the Smarano International Academy event, which is going to be concluded soon, and which was really important for the art improvising in the Partimento edition, with the greatest scholars and the teachers under the artistic direction of Massimiliano Guido, which was focused exactly on the amongst other 18th century towards the Partimento edition. And I'm more than sure that we will have further studies, articles, and papers coming out soon, like the book regarding the solfeggio edition by Nicolas Barvoinath, or other works regarding the Partimento edition, which they will explore furthermore this wonderful tradition. And I want to thank you for this great opportunity. It was difficult to sum up all these tradition, because actually we touched a lot of wonderful points, and thanks a lot to give this opportunity in your show to talk about these very, very fascinating fields and the art of Partimento, which is one of the, I think, greatest music
rediscoveries. I think so. Yes. No, the honor is all mine. Keep doing what you're doing, because it's really changing the world as far as music education. And I think we'll be seeing, in the next decade or so, it completely change. And it'll be thanks to the work that you guys are doing. So, Dr. Marco Pollaci, thank you for everything. And I hope to talk to you soon. Take care.
Take care. Thanks a lot.